The views, opinions, and content provided by our host and guests are just that, opinions and views that are not intended to malign any group, religion, business, individual, or thing. That said, please know that many of the stories shared and topics we discuss on this podcast contain disturbing or emotional content, which may be triggering. As I mentioned on my social media accounts, I basically come with a trigger and content warning, but with lots of love and compassion. This podcast is conducted in a long-form interview style with the hope of capturing some of the deeper considerations and details around survivors' stories. We also hope to help those on the outside who are caring about survivors in a group of high demand, high control, by sharing their perspective and struggles, and also expert voices intended to help us unpack some of the complicated considerations around topics related to cults. Dr. Lily Dunn is an author, mentor, and academic. Her debut nonfiction, Sins of My Father, A Daughter, a Cult, a Wild Unraveling, a memoir about the legacy of her father's addictions, was The Spectator and The Guardian Best Nonfiction Book of 2022. Her forthcoming book, Into Being, The Radical Craft of Memoir and Its Power to Transform, is due to be published by MUP in 2025. She is also author of a work of fiction, Shadowing the Sun, and co-editor of A Wild and Precious Life, an anthology of stories on recovery from mental illness and addiction. She teaches narrative nonfiction and memoir at Bath Spa University and co-runs London Lit Lab. The book we are discussing in this interview is Sins of My Father. The interview has been divided into two parts, and during our discussion, you will hear some excerpts from the book. It is so wonderfully written. We journey this story alongside Lily through her lens as a child into adulthood. Because she allows us so deeply into her thoughts, feelings, and considerations along the way, we are able as readers to consider her story from many perspectives, through many layers and the complications that so many of us struggle with as daughters and sons, trying to reconcile deep love for a parent alongside hurt, loss, grief, and complexities that as children we just don't understand. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the Osho or Rajneesh communities. Lily's is a unique perspective as a child exposed to the group, but perhaps more so, affected by having a parent who was changed by it. So please purchase her memoir. The details are in the show notes. I welcome you to part 2 as we left off in our discussion, having read some excerpts from Sins of My Father. We now enter back into another excerpt, and we hope you enjoy part 2 of this interview with Lily Dunn. As always, thank you for listening. Well, I wonder if I realized there is one more piece that I would like to read, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, of course. I'd love it.
Okay. And this actually, on cue, I was sort of thinking about how the boarding school element is kind of like the cycle begins of the him trying or coping and those strategies kind of being established. And then that cycle kind of coming back with his entry into, the cult world. But then also this thread again seems to come back in this cycle around kind of this theme of sexualization and sex. So this is on page 118. But what I can conclude from the evidence that I have in front of me is that in his attempt to exorcise the sin of conventional sexual expectations and taboos, Bhagwan enabled instead what became a perversion of love. He and his disciples chose to ignore the corruption and abuse of the children who embodied the innocence they were meant to revere. By not acting, they became complicit. The wonder child of my father's book was the new child, the child of Bhagwan's new man, more silent and meditative than our generation was ever allowed to be. My father wrote in the introduction to this book. His text parrots many of Bhagwan's ideas on how to rediscover the magic of innocence by re-engaging with ourselves, our children, and the environment around us. My father sets out his premise to give adults the chance to play with children so that we no longer need to think of them as our children that need our protection. For children need no protection. They have it bound up inside of them from the moment of their birth and before. And it is the adults who take their natural protection away from them by making them adults who have forgotten how to be children. And you state, I can barely tolerate this incoherent rubbish, the fuzz and evasiveness, such careless words. He writes about children as playthings. Adults should play with children for their own use. They must not protect those children because children have an innate sense of how to protect themselves. In fact, by protecting them, we risk taking away their innocence. Warning them of the risks of the world will only contaminate them. This book has nothing to do with children and everything to do with adults justifying their neglect of those children. It is the provocative twaddle that Bhagwan has become notorious for, but my father was no guru.
You can feel my anger in that.
But it feels like protective anger. Right?
Yeah, I read it because that was a book that my dad wrote called Wonder Child. Which
fascinating, this whole thing.
Yeah, it's such a weird, I mean, it couldn't be made, it couldn't be true. Sorry, it's more like it's made up. Because there's so many kind of, coincidences or echoes in the story. But and I think I mention in the book that he was doing photographs for this book. They were photographing, sort of scenes to put into the book when I was staying with him in his house in Italy. And I was a teenager. I was about 12 or 13, I think, 13. And he photographed some sannyasin kids who came to stay, and he didn't photograph me. And I was really upset about this, that he had written a book about children and hadn't photographed his own daughter for the book. And anyway, I revisited the book. I don't think I looked at it for years because this, it was a lasting kind of hurt that he hadn't done that he had overlooked that. I didn't understand how, what was he thinking? Was he doing it to get at me, or was he just so careless and so kind of blind? But I did revisit the book when I was doing my research for this book, and I was just astounded by the total twaddle that was in it. And yeah, that my dad actually believed that stuff. And I mean, it also helped maybe justify some of his behavior towards me as well.
Yes. Well, and that whole message, is just that it really puts, there's no ability to address anything in a responsible manner when the whole philosophy just kind of debunks that, right? That you're everybody's responsible for themselves. That's all they can be responsible for, which means essentially nobody has responsibility to anybody else.
So you can go around and do whatever you want to that person, and you won't ever apologize. If they're hurt, that it's their comeuppance. It's their fault. They can deal with that hurt. They can decide not to be hurt. And he actually said those things to me when I was 6, 7, 8 years old and in a lot of pain because he had left, and I didn't understand why he had left. And he said, you can choose. You can choose to be happy. You can choose to be sad. It's up to you. It has nothing to do with me, which was shocking, really shocking to say that to your child when you've treated them that way.
And because he repeated that so often kind of throughout your life, did you feel like you ever internalized that message?
Oh, I think I definitely internalized it. Yeah, I think I think that was one of the most difficult things for me to get over, some of the things that happened when I was a child, because I was always led to believe that I was too serious or too emotional or, expected too much, or I was a troublemaker, or, it was always battered back at me whenever I confronted him about any of my hurt.
Yeah.
And I think that was definitely damaging. And I still deal with that now to a certain degree. I'm not very good at owning my pain. I sort of try and make things good. I try and override it just to kind of keep the harmony, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The dynamics are so fascinating, how we do internalize these messages and what they end up meaning for us. And that one struck me so much in particular, because I think it's one that is used a lot by cults. And I think it's also what traps a lot of people from being able to actually even kind of see the abuse, right? When you've got a message around that you are responsible for all of your feelings and so on and so forth. Now we're entering into that weird zone of don't be a victim. And the whole inability for anybody to actually be hurt at the cause of somebody else is just null and void. But we all affect one another. That is not the way it works.
And also, there's what I'm learning now as an adult quite late in the day is that actually it's okay to hurt, because that's part of life, and if you're in a relationship with somebody, you hurt each other, you have arguments, you love each other, things are good, you're a multifaceted being, and the relationship is a multifaceted thing. And it's the same when you have children, and it's really important that you can allow for all of those feelings and all of those expressions, and to kind of negate strong feeling, and that whole thing of, you cannot be negative, everything has to be joyful. I think it's a suppression of truth, isn't it? It's a suppression of just simple feeling, which we all have to feel, that we are able to own. And I think it was also one of the big motivations for me writing this book. And, you do see that a lot with memoir, is it evolves out of a kind of oppressed state. Memoirs are often written by people who have found it hard to voice their truth for whatever reason, whether it's because they've been in an abusive relationship, or, had dominant kind of parents, or or in a regime, a political regime where they haven't had a platform, they haven't been able to speak, and I think that memoir becomes a very important space for that exploration and that ownership of your story. And I think that was a big motivation for this book, and it was difficult to write about my father in such explicit, honest terms, but it also felt really, really necessary, and I could justify it because he had been so good at batting me away and so good at keeping me in my place. So
that it's very powerful, Lily. I do feel in the book that we get to be with you in that journey, that we really get to be close with you. And it did, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you that you perhaps addressed a little bit in the beginning But I also wondered, I really wanted to ask you what people have said to you, or if you're open to that, sharing a little bit about some of the personal feedback, because there's so many elements that I imagine people would relate to, if not even just that the simplicity of the, daughter-father relationship. And I wondered if there were kind of like, are people speaking to you more about particular categories of the book?
Hmm. I think, yeah, you're right. It crosses lots of bridges, doesn't it? There's lots of different aspects of the book that would appeal to people, because you've got the addiction, you've got the cult, you've got the daughter-father relationship. I think it also appeals to people who, have anyone in their family who is difficult to love. That could be any member of the family.
Yes.
But I think the main feedback that I've had has been from my generation of people who grew up in the 70s and had kind of hippie parents who were on their own quest, and seemingly sort of aspiring for something greater and freer, perhaps for their children and for themselves, but sort of missing the point somehow, that the children got slightly caught in the crossfire. And I think that's been the strongest, sort of more consistent feedback that I've had. And I think it's also, it comes back to that story of the kids who grew up in the communes kind of finding their voice and finding their story. I think it's definitely a generational thing of people of my age who are looking back on their pasts and trying to make sense of them. And I think that's probably the bit of feedback that I've had that's given me the most pleasure, because if I can help people who perhaps couldn't find the words or couldn't articulate what had happened to them, if I can help them understand it better, and maybe, open those doors, and have those conversations with their parents. So that's been a satisfying bit of feedback that's come back, definitely.
Neat. Yeah, that's... I wondered also, how you have been and kind of how you felt after actually releasing this baby into the world, because it's so personal, as you said. So it was so nice to hear some of the literary awards and accolades that have come with the book, so well deserved. And but I also wondered, just what that was like for you. Did you finish it and then it gets published and it's kind of like, whoa, am I ready for everybody to see this now? Do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that was interesting, that process, because the whole publishing process takes time. So, it was sold probably about 18 months before it was published. So I had plenty of time to kind of get my head around it being out there. And there's various stages to publication. Like, you've got the different editors reading it, copy editor, you've got your editor, you've got the proofreader, then you've got the designer. So you have various stages of gestation, where you can get used to the idea of it being out there.
And perhaps that's even helpful to have some of those eyeballs on it that are actually commenting on it. It's kind of like maybe a process of a little skin toughening as you're about to enter.
Definitely. And then you have this whole process, because I was published by a very well-known publisher here in the UK. They're one of the top publishers here.
They have Routledge?
It's W&N Weidenfeld and Nicholson,
and
they're part of Orion, and who are part of Hachette. So it's one of the big. So we have I think it's 6 main publishers here in the UK who have lots of little publishers that they own. I think the US might be similar to that. So it's one of the big 6. So my editor had all these contacts with good writers who were willing to read early proofs as well. So it also goes through that stage of being sent out before it's published for early readers. And So you get feedback and you get reviews back before it even goes into the newspapers. The proof copies go to the newspapers. So that's another stage of kind of skin hardening, heart rate going. It's like, oh my God, if people are reading it and then they're giving me feedback, and so that was great. But I mean, in terms of actually sort of writing it, it took me a long time to write this book as well. And
I wondered about that, actually. There was something in your acknowledgments area that when I read it, it sounded like maybe it was quite a long process versus I don't know, a year or something.
Oh, it was a lot longer than that. Yeah, it was something. It kind of had different iterations as well. It started as essays, which I got published. Some of them were published. It had 3 different drafts. The book had 3 different significant drafts. The first lot was a collection of essays, and then the second was more of a kind of a stream. It was more of a chronological narrative, and then the third one combined the 2. So I messed up the chronology, as you know, a little bit, but I also then brought back in the critical stuff that I had in the essays. But my point with this is that I think it needed to take its time, because it was such a difficult thing to write in many ways. And I think I needed to detach myself from it in order to have the right kind of narrative distance when I was actually writing it, if that makes any sense. I couldn't be too close to the material. I think I needed to feel in control of it. And that process of feeling in control took many years. Yeah. And I think when I got there, I knew when the book was ready. It just had a kind of authority to it that it hadn't had before. And I wonder whether part of that was about me finding my voice, actually, psychologically as well as through the writing process.
Yes. Brilliant. And you have written other books as well, I understand.
I wrote a novel years ago and got that published in 2007. And I wrote books in between. I had 2 children and wrote 2 novels in between, which I didn't find publishers for. And then started writing these essays and realized actually that, I was more natural in creative nonfiction, and, nonfiction memoir was something that kind of felt not easier, but it fitted with me. I sort of found my voice through writing in that way. So I think I'm definitely on that tack now. That's where my passion lies.
Yeah. Well, and also just in mentioning the publishing houses, I also just found it fascinating that your father was kind of the one that began this publishing company. So you already have this kind of legacy of books in the family. But then I was surprised when your mother and father started that business together. And then your mother goes on to write these books. I can't wait I wanted to look her up online and have access to some of these, because actually the topics for me were really fascinating. And I thought, oh, I should read one of Lily's mother's books.
Yeah, no, she became a very successful biographer of women's stories. So, she wrote Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell and their sisterly relationship. And she wrote, her first biography was on Mary Shelley. So Shelley's wife, who wrote Frankenstein. Yeah. But interestingly for my mom, she has had so my mom's now in her 70s, and she's just started writing romantic Regency romances. So she's had a completely kind of turnaround in her career, and she's on a kind of 3-book series at the moment. She's written 2 of them and she's writing the 3rd. So they're currently being published. So, and that's really exciting to watch as well, that she's come into writing fiction from nonfiction, and I was writing fiction and now I'm writing nonfiction. So
fascinating.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. And may I ask, are you quite close with your brother? And
Yeah, I'm very close with my brother and my mother. Yeah, very close. Yeah.
It's really so lovely to feel that, as you refer to it, kind of the triad, the three legs, the three-legged table that the three of you have been for one another. And so it was really a lovely thing to feel throughout the book. And so I felt like I wanted to just ask about that. Like, everyone's still together, right?
Yeah, no, there's no, there's been no awful kind of fallings out or anything like that, which is what you might expect from memoir, but we've managed to keep it all together. Yeah. The foundations were strong enough for that.
And may I ask, how did I know you go into a little bit in the very beginning about your brother and him kind of explaining a bit as to why he won't be reading it. But I wondered if you would share a little bit about what your mother thought of all of it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think she had enough distance from the story to be okay with it. I think it was difficult for her, as it would be for anyone if your daughter kind of writes an aspect of your life.
Yeah.
But I invited her into the process very much. She's a writer. I'm very close to her. She, gave me stories of her youth and her relationship with my father. And then when I came to drafting it, she read various drafts, and quite late on in the process, I said, "Oh, Mum, I think you better read this before it goes to publication." I said, "But there's not going to be much that you're going to need to change. I'm just want you to read it to make sure that you're okay with it." And it came back with all these red lines going through it and all these little suggestions, editorial suggestions. I was like, "Oh my God." But I think it was also quite important for her to feel that she had a voice in the story as well. And so actually, in the end, she felt quite in control of what was published, which I think was really important. And also, I mean, she has since said to me that if it hadn't been written so well, she may have asked me not to publish it. So, and I think I understand what she means, and I think that good prose kind of asks for forgiveness. If you write something well, you can get away with more, I think, than if it kind of, might come across as gratuitous or a bit scandalous, or, a story for a story's sake, rather than it actually being a sort of artistic exploration of that story. And it was really important for me that the craft of the book was a part of the writing of it as well as the story. It was something that I took pride in. Yeah. So I think that helped, definitely. And I think she's really pleased that it's done so well, because, it does. I mean, when you write books like this, they do come at a cost. You have to hold people's feelings when these books come out, some of which you can't really prepare for. You don't necessarily know how you're going to feel until it comes out into the world.
Right. And the impact that it may have even through other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, suddenly, you've got people reading your story, who you don't even know, and commenting on it. And, that can be quite a weird process.
Yeah. Well, in particular, I really loved the weaving of the story of your birth, and then how at the end there's some resolution and your mother actually kind of taking action. I mean, she just sounds like a very loving and amazing person.
Yeah, she was amazing, and I'm very lucky to have her. Yeah, she was always my defender, always me and my brother's defender.
Which is so important, right? When you've got one parent that's absent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yes. And I also really appreciated the moments between you and your mother, that while there's so much consumption of the longing for father, the ways in which she shows up, or the little moments of I loved when you were going to leave the house and there was really nothing much she could do or say. She had said her piece and then you didn't leave. And then you both end up kind of laughing about the situation.
Yeah, laughing about it like as adults and saying, what would you have done if I had actually left? And that was really nice to kind of go back to that moment with her and reflect on it with her.
Did you have moments of things that you didn't recollect that she could fill in?
That's an interesting question. I mean, yes, there were moments outside of my experience that she filled in for sure. But I think the story of I think my memories were quite intact. And I think a lot of the reason for that was because a lot of them were stories that we had retold each other growing up, or they were attached to photographs. So photographs can act as a really good driver for memory. So, and I actually use photographs quite a lot in my creative writing classes to get people to enter into a time in their childhood or in their life, but also sort of think about what was happening around that photograph, using their imagination, but also trying to recall bits of memory that they may not have kind of readily in the forefront of their mind. And I did that quite a lot in the early drafts of the book, particularly with the childlike sections. So I think, I'm not sure that she remembered any of my childhood stuff. She did actually. It was really interesting talking to her about her perspective, like, when my dad lived in the first commune that he lived in, Medina, which was in Suffolk. Yeah. So I was only 8, and it was interesting to have her perspective of what that was for her, which was, I hadn't really asked her those questions before, what it felt like for her to go there and to see where we were spending our weekends. And she wasn't happy about it at all.
Yeah. Right. I do like that moment in the book.
Yeah.
Well, Lily, is there anything that you'd like to share? Anything that maybe I haven't covered? I so appreciate this particular perspective. And I think also, we had talked about how the story has all these different elements that people might relate to. And the other one that actually occurred to me was people who have been in a family with a narcissist or beyond, but really that challenge, of loving someone so much and really the incapacity for them to give in the way that a child would want, or an adult.
Yeah. Yeah. And often actually people probably have loved a narcissist or had a narcissistic parent that they may not have identified as such. Yes. Because it's such a kind of subtle thing, isn't it? It's quite hard to pin down in a way. And often narcissistic characters are incredibly charismatic and beguiling and interesting, creative, So I think it's quite nice to sort of have been in that position of really trying to interrogate that and pick that apart and understand it for other people as well. Maybe that can be enlightening for them, can be informative for them.
I think it really will be. So, well, thank you so much, Lily.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
It has. I really appreciate it.
And I really enjoyed listening to you reading my extracts as well.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. I botched a little, but again, we're human, right? We can embrace our humanness.
We're all human. Faults and all, yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that I thought I'd share with you that I don't know if you'll be able to relate to this. I sort of have to say it in a weird way. I had this experience that I have not had in a very long time reading the book, where I think it was partly maybe about journeying with you at these different ages as well, where I had this experience of when we're in the now, in our current adult minds and bodies. But sometimes this happens like with smells, I think, where it just kind of takes you back and you can feel everything almost from that perspective of that time. And that was happening to me reading your book, that I think it was just all the different things that I very much related to as well. My family lived abroad quite a bit, so I very much related to kind of the scenes of Italy and things like that. But amidst it, tuning into, I think because I had alcoholism in my family, tuning into these moments of when everything's kind of magical, but the feeling of the pain is there, or the awareness of that deep, sickening, something's wrong. And the book really brought me back to kind of those moments also that I felt like I started to kind of reflect and retrospect on my own life and my life, of course, with my family and alcoholism and everything, and kind of actually like feeling those things again. And it was really interesting for me. It shifted some things inside of me. And also, it had me reach out to people who I really love and to share with them, kind of my besties. I shared with them, I'm reading this book right now in sort of preparation. And I just feel all these things coming up, that kind of, that bizarre experience, how we can be who we are now, but have moments where we really slide back into the whole experience of
Absolutely.
life.
Well, that's a kind of trauma response as well, isn't it? Is sort of, that trauma kind of always being there and coming back as if you are reliving that experience. But it's also, and I'm really glad that you reached out to your friends, because I know that can also be quite upsetting, having that experience when you're on your own and you're not necessarily expecting that to happen.
Yeah.
But I'm also really interested in you saying that, because it wasn't an aim of my book, but through the process of writing the book, I got to understand, I think I touched on this at the beginning, I got to understand my life in a different way. It was almost like framing it in book form or in language that I had chosen helped me to look at it in a new light with a new perspective. And I think that's really interesting that readers can find that they're also having that transformative experience. And to me, that's when memoir's really working hard. It's doing its job, because actually that's what you want to do as a writer, is you want to reach out to your reader and you want to give it, it's almost like a gift, isn't it? It's almost like saying, look, I've spent the last 5 years working on this book, and it's helped me understand aspects of my life better because I've dug really, really deep into it. But now I'm passing it on to you, and I'm really hoping that it's going to have an impact on you, and you're going to relate to it in some way. And so I'm really glad I'm glad for selfish reasons that it had that effect on you, but I'm also really glad that you shared that with your friends, and because then that becomes a sort of transformative thing that it binds you to your friends. It becomes a talking point, and and maybe you and your friends grow through that process as well. They get to understand you better. Yes. So I think that's actually a really wonderful thing. So thank you for sharing that with me.
Yeah, you're welcome. One of the other things that I thought of as we were talking, that just popped in my mind, I heard Gloria Steinem speaking on a podcast recently, and something you said reminded me of this, what she commented on. Maybe we'll remember what you said after I give you this, but she was saying, she framed it from a perspective of being an individual who actually doesn't like confrontation. And she talked about, I mean, we know because her books were so activism oriented, it makes sense that she would be talking about, confrontation. But what she said was that she said, I think sometimes those of us who don't necessarily like confrontation are the writers, because we can sit with our language and our thoughts and have it expressed the way that we want to express it. And there was something that you shared at one point about your process that that made me think of that, and kind of that process, and for you of the being with and being able to serve it in the way that you have some control. Right.
Yeah, and you're able to articulate yourself perhaps in a way that you can't in your day-to-day life. Yeah, and I think, that, I mean, I've always written from a very young age, and from a very young age, I worked out that it was a way of working out my life and my feelings, and I think it can be very powerful in that way, definitely. Yes. And we all have our ways of expressing ourselves, don't we? We find our way. It could be dance or music or art or or talking. Some people are brilliant talkers, and I've always been a writer. It's always been my way of working out the world.
We so hope that you enjoyed this episode. These podcasts were edited by Nathan Lemke. If you'd like to work with him, please reach out to me and I will put him in touch with you. And please stay tuned for part of Leaving the Cult, the season 2 song written by Jaya Suri. And for all things related to Jaya, her music, ways that you can support her, check out the show notes.